Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. It is a very strange morning here in Jerusalem. If you are listening to this on the day of release, it is March 1st, 2026, and the world feels like it shifted on its axis over the last 48 hours. The city is quiet, but it is that heavy kind of quiet where everyone is just glued to their screens or looking at the sky.
It is definitely a somber atmosphere. Herman Poppleberry here, and I think we are all feeling the weight of what just happened. Our housemate Daniel sent us a prompt last night that honestly felt like the only thing worth talking about today. He was asking about the sheer scale of the United States military footprint in this region. After the news yesterday that Iran struck 27 different United States bases across 8 different Arab countries, Daniel wanted to know how we even got to this point. How did the United States end up with this massive sprawling network of bases in places like Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates?
It is a question that feels incredibly urgent now because, for the first time in decades, the price of hosting those bases just became tragically clear. We are looking at 3 United States soldiers killed at Ali al-Salam in Kuwait, a death in Abu Dhabi, and multiple injuries in Qatar. This is not just abstract geopolitics anymore. It is a direct hit on the infrastructure of power projection that we have lived alongside for years.
Exactly, and I think to understand why these missiles were able to find 27 different targets across 8 countries, including Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Oman, you have to understand that this was not an overnight development. This was a slow, deliberate construction of an empire of bases that started at the end of the Second World War and then accelerated like a rocket after 1991 and again after 2001.
So let us pull back the curtain on this. Most people see the headlines about strikes or troop movements, but they do not see the legal and historical scaffolding that holds it all up. Herman, where does the story actually start? Is this a post-World War II phenomenon, or does it go back further?
You have to start in 1945, specifically on a ship called the United States ship Quincy. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt met with King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia. That meeting essentially set the stage for the oil for security arrangement that has defined the last 80 years. The United States needed oil to fuel the post-war boom, and the Gulf monarchies needed a protector. But back then, the footprint was tiny. We are talking about one airfield in Dhahran. The real heavy lifting in the region was still being done by the British.
Right. The British had the protectorate agreements. They were the ones with the naval bases and the colonial ties. When did that handoff happen? Because the United States did not just walk in and demand bases everywhere.
It was 1971. That is the pivotal year. The British government announced they were withdrawing from east of Suez. They literally could not afford to maintain the empire anymore. Suddenly, you had these newly independent or soon-to-be independent states like Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates wondering who was going to fill the vacuum. The United States was hesitant at first. We were still bogged down in Vietnam, and the idea of putting tens of thousands of boots on the ground in the Middle East was not popular. So we went with the Twin Pillars policy.
I remember we touched on this briefly in episode 880 when we were talking about the history of the Iranian Revolution. The Twin Pillars were Iran and Saudi Arabia, right?
Precisely. The United States would arm the Shah of Iran and the House of Saud to the teeth, and they would be the local sheriffs. We did not need our own massive bases because our friends were the ones with the big armies. But then, 1979 happens. The Iranian Revolution flips one of those pillars into an arch-enemy overnight. Suddenly, the United States realizes it has no direct way to protect its interests in the Persian Gulf if the regional powers fail or turn.
And that leads us directly to the Carter Doctrine. This is where the language starts to sound very familiar to what we are hearing today.
It really does. In his 1980 State of the Union address, President Jimmy Carter basically said that any attempt by an outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region would be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States. And he said it would be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. That was the birth of the Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force, which eventually became Central Command, or CENTCOM. Oman was actually the first to sign a formal access agreement in 1980, allowing the United States to use airfields like Thumrait and Masira Island.
But even then, Herman, we were not talking about the kind of permanent city-sized bases we see today. In the 80s, it was more about pre-positioning equipment and having access agreements, right? It was more over the horizon.
Exactly, it was very discreet. The Arab states were actually quite nervous about having a large, visible American presence. It was politically risky for them. They preferred what they called facilities rather than bases. But everything changed in August of 1990. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the nightmare scenario of the Carter Doctrine became real. A regional power was threatening to dominate the world's oil supply.
This is the moment where the dam breaks. 1991 and Operation Desert Storm.
This is the Big Bang for the United States military footprint in the Middle East. To liberate Kuwait, the United States had to move 500,000 troops into the region. They needed massive logistics hubs. They needed airfields. They needed ports. Saudi Arabia opened up Prince Sultan Air Base. Kuwait became a giant staging ground. And once the war ended, the troops never really left.
Why was that? Because the mission was technically over. Saddam was pushed back to Baghdad. Why did the United States stay in such massive numbers throughout the 90s?
It was a combination of two things, containment and a new kind of dependency. Saddam was still in power, so the United States felt it had to stay to enforce the no-fly zones and keep him in a box. But more importantly, the host countries realized they were vulnerable. Kuwait, in particular, was traumatized. They never wanted to be defenseless again. So they signed a formal defense agreement with the United States in 1991. That is the origin of the massive presence at Camp Arifjan and Ali al-Salam.
It is interesting you mention the host country's perspectives, because I think that is the part most people miss. We often frame this as American imperialism, but from the perspective of a place like Kuwait or Bahrain, these bases are essentially an insurance policy. They are paying a premium in the form of sovereignty and political risk to ensure they do not get swallowed by a larger neighbor.
That is exactly the calculation. And it leads us to the legal mechanism that Daniel was asking about, the Status of Forces Agreements, or SOFAs. These are the formal contracts between the United States and the host nation. They are not just about where the barracks are. They cover everything from criminal jurisdiction to taxes to how much the United States pays in rent, though often the rent is not paid in cash but in security guarantees and military aid. Many of these agreements are actually classified, which adds to the local suspicion.
Let us talk about the jurisdiction part, because that is always a flashpoint. If a United States soldier commits a crime in Kuwait or Qatar, who handles it?
In almost every SOFA in the region, the United States maintains primary jurisdiction. This is a huge point of contention for local populations. It means that if there is a traffic accident or a more serious crime involving a service member, they are usually tried by a United States military court, not the local legal system. To the host country's citizens, it can feel like a violation of their laws, but for the United States, it is a non-negotiable requirement for stationing troops abroad. They will not put their soldiers under the legal authority of a foreign government that might have vastly different standards of due process.
And then you have the infrastructure. Take Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. I was reading that the Qatari government actually spent over $1 billion of their own money to build that base in the late 90s, specifically to attract the United States military. They built it before the United States even agreed to move there.
Qatar is the ultimate example of using basing as a strategic shield. Back in the 90s, they were the smaller neighbor to Saudi Arabia, and they were worried about their own security. By building a massive state-of-the-art airbase and inviting the Americans to move their regional headquarters there from Saudi Arabia in 2003, Qatar made themselves indispensable. You cannot attack Qatar without hitting the nerve center of the entire United States Air Force in the Middle East, or at least, that was the theory until yesterday.
We also have to mention the post-9/11 expansion. That is when the footprint went from being a few hubs to a massive network of what they call lily pads.
Right, the invasion of Iraq in 2003 required a whole new level of access. That is how we ended up with permanent presences at Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq and Muwafaq Salti in Jordan. Jordan has become one of the most critical yet quiet partners. They host thousands of troops and provide a buffer for Israel and the Gulf. But as we saw yesterday, being a buffer means you are the first one hit when the missiles fly.
That brings us to the current crisis. If the whole point of these bases for the host nations was to provide a security umbrella, what happens when that umbrella starts attracting lightning? Iran's strike yesterday was not just a message to Washington. It was a message to Kuwait City, Manama, Doha, and Abu Dhabi. It was Iran saying, if you allow your territory to be used as a launchpad for strikes against us, you are a combatant.
And that is the terrifying shift. The joint United States-Israeli strikes on February 28 that killed Ayatollah Khamenei were unprecedented, but the Iranian response was equally unprecedented in its geographic scope. By hitting 27 bases across 8 countries, Iran effectively declared that there are no safe zones. If you host a United States drone, a United States fighter jet, or even a United States refueling tanker, you are in the line of fire.
I want to dig into the specifics of some of these locations because the scale is just mind-boggling when you look at the map. Let's start with Bahrain. That is the home of the United States Fifth Fleet.
Bahrain is the oldest continuous naval presence we have in the region. It goes back to 1948. It is a relatively small island nation, but it hosts thousands of United States personnel at Naval Support Activity Bahrain. The Fifth Fleet is responsible for about 2.5 million square miles of water, including the Strait of Hormuz. For Bahrain, hosting the fleet is their entire national security strategy. But they are also a majority Shia country ruled by a Sunni monarchy. When Iran hits a base in Bahrain, it is not just a military strike, it is an attempt to destabilize the internal politics of the country.
And then you have the United Arab Emirates. We saw a death in Abu Dhabi yesterday. The United Arab Emirates has Al Dhafra Air Base, which is one of the most active air bases in the world for the United States. They have been a key partner in everything, from the war on terror to the recent operations against the Houthis. But the Emirates have also been trying to play a very delicate diplomatic game with Iran lately, trying to de-escalate.
That is the tragedy of the current situation. The Gulf states have spent the last 3 years trying to lower the temperature. They have been restoring diplomatic ties with Tehran. They have been trying to position themselves as neutral hubs for trade and tourism, but they are still tethered to the United States military machine. When the United States and Israel decided to take out Khamenei, they did not ask the Emirates for permission, but the Emirates are the ones dealing with the debris in Abu Dhabi today.
It feels like a fundamental breakdown of the bargain. If I am the leader of Kuwait today, and I have 3 dead people at Ali al-Salem, I am looking at that 1991 defense agreement very differently. I am asking, is the protection the United States provides worth the fact that my country just became a front line in a war I did not choose?
This is what analysts call decoupling. For decades, the interests of the United States and the Gulf monarchies were almost perfectly aligned. They both wanted stable oil prices, and they both wanted to contain Iran. But now, their interests are diverging. The United States is focused on great power competition and high-intensity conflict with Iran. The Gulf states are focused on economic diversification and survival. They cannot afford a regional war. It would destroy everything they have built in places like Dubai or Lusail.
We talked about this in episode 878, when we looked at the engineering of survival and deep shelters. The physical infrastructure of these countries is incredibly sophisticated, but it is also incredibly fragile. You can build the most beautiful skyscraper in the world, but if a ballistic missile hits the power plant or the desalination plant next to it, the city becomes uninhabitable in days.
Exactly, and the United States bases are often located right next to this critical civilian infrastructure. In some cases, they share runways with international airports, so the margin for error is zero. When Iran launches a drone swarm or a cruise missile attack, even if the United States defenses intercept 90% of them, the 10% that get through can cause catastrophic damage to the host nation.
Let us talk about the specific casualty at Ali al-Salem in Kuwait. 3 United States soldiers. We have seen attacks on bases in Iraq and Syria for years, but Kuwait has generally been considered a safe rear area. It is where soldiers go for R&R, or for transit. To have a mass casualty event, there is a massive psychological blow.
It changes the geography of the conflict. It tells the United States that there is no such thing as a safe base in the Middle East anymore. If you are within 2,000 kilometers of Iran's borders, you are in the red zone. This is going to lead to some very hard conversations about the Global Defense Posture Review. The United States has been trying to pivot to Asia for over a decade, but it keeps getting pulled back. Now the question is, can the United States even afford to stay in these bases if they require this much defense?
There is also the question of what the host countries might do. Do you think we could see a situation where a country like Oman or even Qatar asks the United States to limit its operations or even leave?
It is already happening in subtle ways. We have seen reports over the last year of Gulf countries placing restrictions on where United States planes can fly from their bases when conducting strikes in Yemen or Iraq. They do not want to be seen as the launching pad for offensive operations. But after yesterday, the pressure will be immense. You might see host nations demanding a veto over any United States missions launched from their soil. And if the United States says no, then the basing agreement itself comes into question.
That would be a seismic shift. If the United States loses access to Al Udeid or the Fifth Fleet headquarters, its ability to project power in the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf is basically cut in half.
It would be the end of the era that started in 1991. We would be moving back to that over-the-horizon posture that Carter originally envisioned, but without the friendly pillars to support it. It is a much more dangerous and unpredictable world.
I want to go back to the sofas for a second because I think people underestimate how much these legal documents shape the day-to-day life in these countries. It is not just about the military. It is about the thousands of contractors, the families, the entire economy that grows around these bases. In Bahrain, the United States base is essentially a city within a city.
It is, and that creates a weird kind of cultural friction. You have these pockets of American life where people are buying groceries at a commissary and watching American television, surrounded by a society that might be increasingly hostile to the foreign policy those bases represent. When things are peaceful, you can ignore the friction. But when the missiles start falling, the presence of those Americans becomes a very visible reminder of the risk the government is taking.
It reminds me of what we discussed in episode 881 about the human element of spying and real-time intelligence. These bases are not just parking lots for planes. They are massive vacuum cleaners for signals intelligence. They are the ears and eyes of the United States across the entire region. If you lose those bases, you do not just lose the ability to strike, you lose the ability to see what is happening.
That is why the United States will fight tooth and nail to keep them. They will offer more advanced air defense systems, more intelligence sharing, more formal security treaties. They might even try to move toward something like a NATO-style Article 5 guarantee for some of these countries. But the question is, does the host nation believe the guarantee anymore? If the United States could not prevent 27 bases from being hit yesterday, how can they guarantee the safety of the host nation's capital tomorrow?
It is the credibility gap, and it is being exploited very effectively by Iran. By hitting so many targets at once, they showed that the United States cannot be everywhere at once. Even with the best missile defense in the world, the sheer volume of a coordinated strike can overwhelm the system.
We should also talk about the specific role of Jordan in this. We have seen strikes on bases in Jordan before, like Tower 22, but the scale of the Iranian retaliation yesterday included targets in Jordan as well. Jordan is in an incredibly tough spot because they have a very close intelligence and military relationship with the United States, but they also have a population that is very sensitive to any perception of being a Western proxy.
Jordan is the buffer state. If Jordan's stability is threatened because of these basing agreements, the entire Levant becomes a powder keg. This is why the geography of these bases matters so much. They are not just dots on a map. They are integrated into the social and political fabric of the countries they are in.
I think we need to look at the long-term historical arc here. If you look at the history of empires, they often overextend by building more bases than they can realistically defend. The British did it, the Romans did it. The United States has over 700 bases worldwide, but the concentration in the Middle East is unique because of the volatility of the region. We are seeing the first real stress test of that entire system since the end of the Cold War.
So, what is the takeaway for our listeners who are trying to make sense of the news today? When you see a headline about a strike on a base in Kuwait or Qatar, do not just think of it as a military target. Think of it as a piece of 80-year-old historical puzzle. It is the result of the British leaving in 71, the Iranian Revolution in 79, and the invasion of Kuwait in 90. These bases are monuments to past crises, and now they are the focal points of a new one.
That is a great way to put it. They are historical artifacts that are still very much alive and very much lethal, and for the people living in those countries, the presence of those bases is no longer a silent background fact of life. It is the most important factor in whether or not they are safe in their own homes.
It really makes you rethink the concept of a security guarantee. Is it a shield or a magnet? For a long time, the answer was clearly a shield. Today, it looks a lot more like a magnet.
And that shift in perception is what could lead to the most significant realignment of power in the Middle East in our lifetime. If the Gulf states decide that the magnet is too dangerous, the United States will have to find a completely new way to interact with this part of the world.
It is a lot to process, especially on a day like today. Herman, I appreciate you walking through the history. It helps to have that context when the world feels like it is moving too fast to understand.
Of course, it is what we do. And honestly, it helps me process it too. Digging into the research and seeing the patterns makes the chaos feel a little bit more logical, even if it is still tragic.
Well, we are going to keep watching this closely. There are still so many unanswered questions about what comes next. How will the United States respond? Will there be another round of Iranian strikes? And how will the governments in Kuwait, Bahrain, and the others react to the casualties on their soil?
We will probably be talking about this for many episodes to come. It feels like a turning point.
Before we wrap up, I just want to say thanks again to Daniel for sending this in. It was exactly the right question for today. And to all of you listening, we know things feel uncertain right now, especially if you are in the region. We appreciate you spending some of your time with us.
Definitely. And hey, if you find these deep dives helpful, please consider leaving us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It really does help the show reach more people who are looking for this kind of context. We read all of them, and we really appreciate the support.
You can find all our past episodes and a way to get in touch with us at our website, myweirdprompts.com. We are also on Spotify and most other podcast platforms. We will be back soon with more exploration of the weird, the complex, and the urgent questions that Daniel sends our way.
Stay curious and stay safe out there. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Thanks for listening. We will talk to you next time.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.